Hi, welcome back to another episode of Stand on Guard. It's Thursday, August 22nd, 2024. And we come back. Do you think the government's lying to you about inflation? About how bad it really is? I think so too. When we come back, we're going to have a look at that.
So we are in a very precarious position in this country. We need political change, but we also need the resolve to resist.
Yes, as Sasha always said, please like the broadcast. Yeah, I'm not going to go on today about YouTube suppression. Whatever will be, will be. And we do our best. You guys do your best to support this station. Thank you so much. I think we offer here something a little different than just endless clips of other people's news. But I hope my analysis is helpful. I've spent my life working in this business of journalism, one way or the other. I've been on all three sides of the mic, as I like to say, and I've never lived through a more interesting and more dangerous time. I have a sense of history, I think, largely because I've read a lot of history and I've traveled to historic places, and I've always had a sense of where we are in terms of historical events and being in the midst of history unfolding. That's what's happening right now. We are on the brink of possibly two nuclear wars, and nobody really seems to give a damn about it at the government level. They're more concerned about gender ideology and about Pride Month and Pride season in this country. And this is absolutely incredible. But they also love to tell you that inflation is no big deal. How many times do you hear that? I mean, how many? And of course, they're lauding the Trudeau government's lauding the July numbers, right? Like it's hey, no big problem here. No big problem. And let's have a look at some of these, as we're saying, cooking the books. Yeah, they are cooking the books. Let's have a look at this. OECD predicts Canada will be the worst performing advanced economy over 2020, 2026. That's the reality here. That's what's really happening. And I've got a video to show you in a second, which will really put this in perspective in terms of how bad things really are. I know you're thinking, hey, I go to the store and nothing seems to cost the same. Look at our standard of living versus the United States. And the United States is on the brink of an economic catastrophe. They're about to lose the dollar as the chief monetary factor in oil. The US dollar will no longer be the currency in oil purchasing. Look at that standard of living. We are dropping drastically here. Standard of living is the worst in 40 years. It's declining faster than we can possibly even imagine. I got a number of other slides from the Fraser Institute that I want to show you after we talk about this. But food bank usage in Toronto. That's going up in a straight line. Now, you often hear Polyev talk about the food banks are busy and the tent cities are busy. We talked about that the other day, the fact that the homeless problem is incredible. But what does the Trudeau government do? They just give you their statistics and say, no problem. We're doing this. And you can't see evidence of it? Don't worry. Now, I'm going to show you a video in a second because the problem I always have with this is that we're being told like inflation is so small that the numbers being quoted at one time would have been considered no inflation. If you're old enough to remember the 1970s, or if you're a kid and you remember your parents talking about the price of consumer goods in the 1970s, inflation was like at 18 to 20% at one point. But that's because the numbers weren't being fudged. They weren't cooking the numbers to make them look like it's not a real issue. People went to the grocery store and they said, hey, I spent $20 on a bag of groceries. Never done that before. You go to the grocery store today. For instance, there's a certain coffee I buy. It was $9.99 a year ago. Now it's up to about $12.99 now, sometimes higher. And yet I'm being told that the inflation rate is so small, that shouldn't be happening. Everybody has anecdotal information about how bad inflation is. All you have to do is go to the grocery store every week. All you have to do is just be a consumer of goods and services, and you know the price is escalating. But the government keeps telling us it's no problem. Don't worry about it. And that is, and I've suspected from the very beginning here, there's something wrong with the numbers because we're not getting the truth from the government. They don't want to tell you the truth because they don't think you can handle it. Because we've totally changed the way we gauge inflation, how we measure inflation. And I think this video here explains it even better than I could probably do that. I'm not an economist. I'm a political scientist. I'm a journalist, but I'm not an economist. And I do my best to interpret economics. But I think this is a very good video, and I'll stop it in certain places just to elaborate. But if you think we're not living through the 1970s again, we are. Oh, sorry. It's not the one I wanted to show you. Here we go.
Let's all celebrate, but don't go and spend all of that hard-earned cash because prices are still going up and we're all getting poorer, just at a slower rate. And let's absolutely not pay attention to compounding inflation. Let me explain.
To prices being there. And you don't really see that in this data, okay? Because inflation is really just measuring the difference between that and that. And if you look at those two lines, you're talking about a 2.3% change. That's the number we're talking about today. But for a lot of people, it's not about that. It's about the difference between this and that. And when you look at the difference between this and that, that's 20%. And I think
this, illustrates the problem quite well. And it's easy to understand this chart, this graph here. That's why you have no money left at the end of the month. Are you getting paid 20% more than you were? No. Where's that 20% going? In taxes as well, and in inflation. Inflation is eating up your savings. You have no savings left, and you have nothing left to save at the end of the month. This is going to create grinding poverty. And where do you think that's leading? Why would the government want to impoverish people? Why would the Trudeau government want to impoverish Canada? So they are more reliant on the government than ever. So you can't make it on your own. You can't make it with your job. You're going to be constantly out of money, short of funds. That's what they're up to. Let's watch some more of this.
that's the dichotomy here between these inflation numbers where it looks normal and this, which is really not normal at all.
There you have it. So if inflation increased by 25% last year, but we're basing this year on last year and it's only increased by 2.5% today, everything is fine. Canada has never had it so good. I'm going to go over the inflation data, but before we begin, I 100% guarantee with 100% certainty the Liberal caucus is already all over social media announcing this wonderful drop in inflation. Starting with our very own Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Freeland. You know what? Right when I checked 23 seconds ago, guess who chimed in? Freeland. Good news, Canada, she writes. Everything is going up to the moon. But guess what? It's only going up now at a slower pace of 2.5%. The Bank of Canada now has lowered interest rates twice, making Canada the first country in the G7 to do so. This is a positive sign our economic plan is working. You have to be effing kidding me. We are watching a freight train crash in slow motion. The reason that inflation is going down is because Canadians can't afford to spend any freaking money and our economy is imploding. So how do you know that a finance minister knows nothing about economics without saying that she knows nothing about economics? Just head over to her social media account. Now it's time to look at some data. I'm going to close with some comments. Let's go.
Before he goes on there, that's exactly what happened, of course, when the inflation rate was released for July, 2.5%. Trudeau took credit. Freeland took credit, and the government kept telling you, don't worry, 2.5% is nothing. And as I said, in the 1970s, if they had said the inflation rate was 2.5%, people would have said, hey, the inflation is over. That's like having unemployment at 2.5%. It's basically negligible. So this is why they can continue to tell you that inflation is not a problem, because they've redefined inflation. And that is what, and as I say, if that was all there was to it, if it was just about deceiving you into thinking this government was doing a hell of a good job with the economy, that would be one thing, and that would be bad enough. But this government is trying to convince you that they're doing a good job with the economy, even though they know you have less money in the bank, less money in your pockets, less money to spend on anything except basic essentials. This is why in this country, only 2% of disposable income is going towards clothing. How long do you think that's going to sustain stores that sell clothing? We used to spend 12% of our disposable income on new clothes in 1961, according to a Fraser report. We're spending 2% now. That is a recipe for the destruction of an entire industry because Canadians can't afford. They have no disposable income. The disposable income is going on healthcare costs. You think it's free in this country? No. We're paying more than the U.S. in taxes for our healthcare. Let's listen to some more of this.
Inflation is down to 2.5% in the month of July. Food purchased in store, 2.1%. It's still going up. The number one driver of inflation is shelter, and it's still 5.7% down from 6.2%. We're going to see improvement as interest rates do come down. And transportation is up 2%. They're elevated because gas prices in the prairies is up because of a shutdown in a refinery in western United States. 12-month change to inflation, excluding gasoline and including gasoline, we are heading down. Everything is down this time around. We're still way down on clothing and footwear. That means people are not spending money. And shelter is starting to push our inflation rate down. And this chart is the one that stands out the most to me. This is purchasing a car in Canada, including resale. It has literally fallen right off. This means our economy is not performing great because the first thing to go is, you know what? I'm going to sell my second car and I'm definitely not purchasing a new one. And
This is fascinating to me. Now, this is exactly what I'm talking about. The reason they can say inflation is not so high is because we're not spending money on items at all. So if you're not spending money on items, well, they can't be inflationary, can they? So we're not buying new cars. We're not buying new clothes. We're not spending disposable income on things like this because we have no disposable income. It's a vicious cycle. This is what is being described here. So therefore, it's not inflationary if you can't buy things, because it just doesn't become part of the equation. This is how they're cooking the books. They're taking these things out of the equation. And I think this individual really sums it up well. And by the way, please like the station, hit the like buttons. YouTube is doing it again today, trying to prevent you from watching this because they don't want you to know about inflation, believe me. Try
A
again.
car in Canada, including resale, it has literally fallen right off. This means our economy is not performing great because the first thing to go is, you know what? I'm going to sell my second car and I'm definitely not purchasing a new one. And 50% of the provinces saw a decrease in inflation. And if you made it this far in the video, you are in luck because I saved the best for last. This is the most important chart. When the red line goes below the blue line, like right here, that means
Right
the
here.
Bank of Canada is over tightening and they are definitely going to cause a recession if we're not already in one. To close, 1% of inflation is because of the Bank of Canada's mortgage interest rates. So if they cut the interest rate to 2%, inflation would drop down to 1.5%. They don't want inflation to go below 2%, so they're not going to be cutting interest rates to 2%. That is why I believe the terminal rate will be 2.5 to 2.75%. The Bank of Canada has an interest rate announcement on September 4th, just 2 weeks away. And yes, they're going to be cutting. The Bank of Canada better start cutting and start cutting sharply. These 2.5% interest rate cuts, peanut size, are going to do absolutely nothing. They need a cut by at least 50 basis points in 2 weeks. We're going to see what they're going to do. But guess what? It's probably already too late.
Probably already too late. And I can see by the numbers, this is not having much traction today. But I think it's an issue we have to deal with. Every video can't be crowds chanting "I hate Trudeau." So sometimes we have to deal with real issues, and that's what we're here for. But I find this, I think this is absolutely fascinating. What's going on here, and it is a perfect example of how this government wants you to believe something and is willing to do whatever it thinks it has to do to make you believe that. Now, here's a Fraser report here. This is Canada's debt. Canada's debt is spiraling out of control. And it's been doing that since Justin Trudeau came into office. Just like what Joe Biden has done in the United States in 4 years, what Trudeau's been working on here for 9 years now. The national debt is going through the roof. And what happens when it all collapses? See, we're entering into a period. The video I just showed didn't use the phrase, but there was an expression in the 1970s. It was a new phenomena called stagflation, where you had a stagnant economy, a recession, at the same time you had inflation. That's what the 1970s were. You had sort of a constant recession of people looking for jobs that actually paid enough money, and inflation persisted throughout the 1970s. It was a horrible economic climate, and that's exactly where we are today. There's Canada's net debt. It is escalating, and there's no end in sight. Another one. Canada's gross debt, no CP or Quebec pension included. Absolutely incredible. By using net debt as a share of the economy, Canada ranks 5th lowest of 32 countries and lowest amongst the G7. You remember, how Trudeau, because a lot of you watched Question Period with me. What's the one thing you always say, you always hear from the Liberal front bench? It doesn't matter if the question has anything to do with it, but the answer is always Canada is number one amongst the G7. Our credit rating is just great. We're actually lowest among the G7, our debt. By using gross debt as a share of the economy, Canada falls to 26th of 32 countries and is third lowest in the G7. Canada experiences the largest change in its indebtedness ranking, falling 21 places when the measure shifts from net debt to gross debt. One reason for this pronounced change in ranking is that the net debt includes the assets of the Canada and Quebec pension plans. You remember how we're always saying they're spending the pension? They're robbing the pension. That's what they're doing. According to IMF, International Monetary Fund data, the difference between Canada's gross and net debt was 2.7 trillion at the end of 2023, which means the assets of CPP and QPP explain more than 1/4 of the difference. So that is what they're up to. And I think this should shock you. This should shock you, but I'm sure it doesn't, because you know what this government is up to. It's a smokescreen. It's camouflage. And this is why during Question Period, which I know a lot of you watch with me when I do that live, and I did that live for the last year. I know it can be agonizing at times, but you get the same answer from these government ministers. We're highest in the G7. For what? Oh, yeah, and our credit rating is really good. Oh, yes, and 8 out of 10 Canadians receive more back from the so-called Canada carbon rebate than they actually are forced to spend in the carbon tax. All lies. The Liberal government has completely fabricated all of this. And if you really look at the Question Period, there's about 5 different talking points that the ministers all share. And they use these talking points no matter what the question is. And when it comes to inflation, we're doing better than anybody in the G7. That's always the claim, and it's always a false claim. It's not happening. So I leave that with you today. I want to talk about a couple of other things before I leave you. I usually spend about 25 minutes. Just thank you again for your support. Please share this station with your friends and family, because we're under tremendous YouTube pressure right now. I don't know if you, people are being kicked off YouTube now for a week. Judge Napolitano, for instance, who I watch every day, he does foreign policy with some fantastic guests. He revealed yesterday he was kicked off YouTube for a week because of a segment that YouTube deemed to be hate speech. And of course, I watched the segment. I didn't think there was any hate speech there. But he was kicked off the platform for a week. Other people are getting black marks for the smallest of things. And the reason why it's very delicate right now, it's like walking on eggshells. And they are deliberately suppressing shows like this because of the U.S. election. They put the warning out. Google put the warning out. Google, which owns YouTube, put the warning out a couple of months ago that they were going to be monitoring broadcasts very closely because of the federal U.S. election. And yes, they don't want any disinformation out there about that election. So they'll be very diligent in pulling down anything they disagree with. So that's what we're up against with YouTube censorship and suppression. And it's quite frightening. Now, what's happening for the rest? I'm going back to the trial tomorrow of Tamara Lich and Chris Barber. This is supposed to be the last day of the summation. I was told the other day by a well-placed source, I can't say who told me this, that the Crown wants to end things on Friday. I know this is a bit of a departure from the rest of the show, but I thought I should discuss this with you because I will be doing a show tomorrow, but after the trial is over in the afternoon, probably 6 o'clock or so. But I've been told by a well-placed source the Crown wants this trial to end tomorrow in terms of the testimony because they have spent so much money on a mischief trial. They just want to get this thing done because it's beginning to get really embarrassing for the prosecution. I'm going to find out, by the way, how much money the Crown has spent persecuting Tamara Lich and Chris Barber. How many millions of dollars has this cost the Crown? Also known as taxpayers. And I know you can say, well, what's $2 or $3 or $4 million when it comes to government spending? That's not the point. The point is that they would spend $2 or $3 or $4 million on a mischief trial that should have been resolved before it even went to trial, as it usually is for anybody else. If the government didn't want a show trial, it would have been over. It would never have gone to trial. But and don't forget, who's to blame on this? Yes, Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act. Yes, Justin Trudeau crushed the Freedom Convoy with the full force of police. Yes, Justin Trudeau was the one who dismissed all the protesters as racist and misogynist. But Tamara Lich and Chris Barber are sitting in a provincial courthouse every time they come to Ottawa. So that's the provincial government of Ontario, the Ford government, the faux conservative Doug Ford government that continues this action and that has initiated this judicial action against Tamara Lich and Chris Barber. That's who's behind all this. And it's something I think we should all remember. So I'm going back tomorrow. I think that's going to be the last day. But as I said during my last broadcast about the Freedom Convoy trial, we're not going to get a verdict on this until maybe early January 2025, maybe as late as March or April. Nobody can really tell. But it's not going to be, somebody said to me this morning, oh, we're going to get a verdict next week, right? No. We're going to get a verdict in early 2025. That to me is outrageous. These people have been put through judicial hell. This has been lawfare waged against them. And I really do think there's a lesson here for all Canadians. And if these two go down to defeat in this, Canada goes down to defeat. And our freedom of speech and our freedom of assembly has been perhaps irreparably harmed by the state in this country. And that's what we have to guard against. So I'm going to leave it at that today. Thank you so much for watching. Please share this broadcast with your friends and family. And thank you for being a supporter of the Krayden's Right channel and the Stand on Guard show. I'm here, as always, to give you all the news you need to know.